Thank you very much. I have to say, after Karen's presentation, I'm feeling a little anxious because we don't have some cute cats to show you, and we have no suicidal cows to show you either. But what I do have is a great panel of industry leaders with me today who've got a tremendous amount of insight to share with you. So what I'm going to do first of all is turn over to each of them to introduce themselves. So Frank, if we start with you.
Thank you, Heather. Frank Lady, about 25 years of business continuity experience in one way or another, 10 years with the Army and contingency organizations, and then 14 years in the private sector with financial services organizations, PNC, Merrill Lynch, and Bank of America.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks, Heather. I'm Joseph Easter from Capital One, and I lead business continuity, crisis management, third-party management, and insurance for the enterprise.
And I'm Linda Jarrell, and I'm the CIO and Executive Director of Department of Technology for the City and County of San Francisco. We're very pleased to be here with my staff, and the city is large. It's 30,000 employees, $10 billion budget, and I think you all know how important resiliency and disaster preparedness is to local government.
Thank you very much. Now, the session is titled Your Questions Answered, so can I just remind you about Slido, because we'd love to be answering your questions as we go through the session. Please do open it up, so it's slido.com and then the /DRJ Spring. We'd also like to challenge you as we go through this session to just think about one nugget of information that you can take away with you. You may have looked through your pack of information, and there were 10 top tips in there from the BCI. One of them is looking out for those golden nuggets. So we want to challenge you to take away one thing, whether it's going back and talking to leadership and trying to improve that leadership buy-in, whether it's going back with some of the trends, some of the insights from the leaders here today and what they're looking at, what are their concerns at the moment, or whether it's something for you to enhance your own professional development. How are you going to make that next step forward in your career? So have a think through that, and we will remind you at the end as well, because we'd really love for you to take that one top tip away that you can action when you get back to your workplace. Okay, so as was mentioned, we're going to go through 3 segments during this session. The first one is we're going to look at evolving trends and 2018 priorities. So we're going to start by asking the panel from their own perspectives, how do you perceive business continuity and organizational resilience to be evolving? So perhaps, Linda, could we start with yourself?
Well, I'd be happy to. And of course, you all know the big trend right now is tech, and all the billions of ways tech can cause a disaster, can cause problems in your organization, the many vectors of attack, the many ways tech can be disruptive. And I think if you don't already know who your cybersecurity professional is in your organization, now's the time to know that person and form a partnership, because it really is about how our business systems are affected, where those risks are, what we can do to mitigate it, and how we can collaborate with each other, especially in settings such as this, to really understand what is new in our world, what we do need to be prepared for, and where the next opportunity to stay safe is.
Thank you. Frank, what about yourself?
Well, I think names and labels, organizational labels are important, and they reflect mindset change. And so at Bank of America, the corporate business continuity group is now no longer that, but it's now enterprise resilience. So first of all, that says we are embracing the broader perspective, but in line with some of the things that Linda mentioned, the alignment with other key organizations that may not be responsible necessarily for business continuity particularly, but information security, physical security, other groups is crucial.
Thank you. And this ties in with another question that we had to pose, which is we are seeing a real trend towards convergence. We've seen the ISO standard around organizational resilience, and there's a lot more talk in the industry about how we need to be linking in with risk management, with technology, with cyber, with information security, with privacy and the GDPR that was mentioned in the last session. Joseph, could you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of conversion?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm going to mention one that you didn't have in that list is third-party management. And I mentioned that when I started, that's one of the areas I oversee. And recently, we actually brought the leadership of business continuity and third-party management together because we're finding that so much of what we rely on, and to Linda's point, both from the technology standpoint as well as all operations, really are from our third parties and vendors. And for too long, honestly, I think many companies have looked at that as we've outsourced and so they're in good shape. Do they assert they have plans? Can they tell us they tested? But really, our regulators are pointing out, and we already knew, but they're certainly focusing it for us, that we've got to be able to be more diligent about that and really get out with our third parties, prove to ourselves that they can recover as well. And so we want to see that collaborate much more and a close partnership.
Great, thank you. Linda, sorry, go ahead,
I'm just going
Frank.
to tag on one thing because I couldn't agree more. To me, I think that's one of the biggest opportunities for business continuity as we look into the future is not only the things that you mentioned, but how we integrate business continuity responsibilities and requirements with those organizations that are part of our wider stakeholder set. And I think that's a challenge that hasn't been fully solved by a long shot.
Definitely not.
So from a government perspective, what San Francisco has done is established a Lifelines Council. And what that is, our business leaders and government leaders from around San Francisco coming together under the direction of the mayor to talk about reducing our time to recovery. So it is all of the utility companies, it's the port, it's law enforcement, it's fire, it's 30 departments from the city, all working together and meeting together and talking about how we're making investments, what are we doing about not only duplicate networks and resilient networks, but water systems and investments to make sure that we don't have single points of failure. So it's really appropriate that we don't meet each other for the first time at a disaster, right? That's like the worst thing you can do. So meeting people ahead of time, knowing who these leaders are, knowing the engineers, putting names with faces so they're not just an email is really what we're trying to focus on right now. And we meet quarterly. I mean, it's a time commitment, but it's also a small group of people that are pushing this forward, and I think we're making real progress.
Great. We've got a question from the audience which has come in, which is, can we explain the difference between enterprise resiliency and business continuity management? Frank.
So I think the primary difference is, or the evolutionary difference is how do we prevent things from failing? That's the first thing. And I know in the technology world that has led companies to build automatic failover for key applications or redundant production environments where one fails, the other one is still active, and so the customer perspective is never interfered with. So how can we avoid breaking in the first place so that what we're recovering, if we are recovering something, is really kind of behind the scenes to the customer-facing population?
And in terms of the resiliency, I perceive that's where we need to have that coordination, but business continuity remains the discipline of BC planning.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Joseph, would you like to comment on that as well?
I completely agree with Frank, and I think the difference is for years we talked about starting really with planning, going through testing, and then actually recovering and managing through that. It's the prevention piece that Frank mentioned for sure. We've talked about it to some degree. I think the difference is actually doing it and investing a ton in that.
Thank you. In terms of topics that are front and center on your radar at the moment, would you mind talking us through a couple of things that you're thinking of right now, this year? What needs addressing within your own organizations? Let's start with Linda.
So one thing that is right on my mind today, because it's happening right now, is an emergency that I'm dealing with. And it's all, of course, around technology, but it's around our communication systems. So when you think of your technology systems and your solutions, you think about, okay, I have to protect my network. I have to protect my data center. I have to protect the endpoints. Well, you have to think broader than that. It is your Wi-Fi networks. And what happened to, let's remember, the city of Atlanta recently, they immediately shut down their Wi-Fi networks, et cetera. But I challenge you to think even broader. Many of us, government especially, have other kinds of networks, radio networks, right? So you're carrying communication on radio RF frequencies, you're carrying communication through your, possibly your SCADA systems and that sort of thing. And I challenge you all to please investigate those systems, do pen testing on them, and make sure that those are resilient. Many of these systems, especially in San Francisco, are 20 years old, and they're legacy technology, and we forget that they're there. You may test them every single Tuesday, our outside public warning sirens, but you haven't thought about, are they vulnerable to a hack? So please think about all your different types of communication and your systems that need to be protected.
Thank you. Joseph.
I think that's a great point, Linda. And really, when I think about what's most important for us right now, it is the cyber component and the potential for hacking and disruption there. And if you were looking 5 and 10 years ago, principally you were thinking, what could happen from within our company? What do we essentially do to ourselves that cause a disruption? And you can, for the most part, anticipate those and plan for them, and that's what a lot of our programs are built for. But now when you're thinking about what's going to happen to us from people maliciously trying to attack the company or the government, it's a whole different ballgame there. And so certainly the partnerships we mentioned earlier, I don't think business continuity professionals can do it on our own. It involves partnership with our information security professionals, our physical security teams, third party, as we mentioned, and everybody working together. And not every company has those groups that are willing to partner together. A lot of times they're really operating in silos. Potentially there's duplication, but even worse, there's the potential that something's being dropped between those silos and nobody's focused on some of the areas.
Thank you. Frank, what's front and center from your perspective?
Certainly, in addition to those, I think one of the challenges for us is that as the organization changes in its third-party relationships, what we're seeing happen is that some things that we did before now are done by vendors. And so we need to go back and look at some of our more complex responsibilities, such as in a pandemic response, and say, okay, how do we do this in the light of the different legal and third-party relationships that now exist? Are we clear on who's going to do that, and have the geographic responsibilities changed? So how is an important question to apply over the new organizational reality.
Thank you.
Just going to add one point to that one for a second, is when we're seeing the business plans put together for outsourcing, you're always looking at the how much is this going to effectively save the company? And I find that all too often companies are not taking into account what they're going to have to spend on additional risk resources, whether those are people, whether those are programs, systems, et cetera. And I think one of the things we can do is really get out and educate our partners in the lines of business that it's okay generally to outsource, but you really need to consider the true cost for that.
I want to add a point to that, how important that is, especially in technology. I had in a previous life a data breach, and it was not the vendor that I had contracted with. It actually was their subcontractor. And so I think it's down the chain, and it's how you structure your contracts, the liability, and also possibly the insurance that you're carrying. And it's also educating our attorneys, right? Our attorneys don't even know how to look at risk now because it comes from so many different directions. So please consider not only your contractors, but your subs as you move into your cybersecurity insurance and your projects.
I'd like to actually pull on that one for a minute, because I think we find that the legal instruments that exist for contracting are quite good. We've learned a lot about that from a legal perspective. They're bulletproof. But business continuity, eyes looking on that, will find things that are clearly not right. They're not clear. They're missing altogether. And so it's so really important to have a business continuity eyes in the process of the contracting effort.
Okay, we're getting some questions through around the leadership buy-in and the board. Could I just pause for 1 minute and ask the AV team to set the clock to the right time for us? Because it's still telling us we've got a full hour to go. This could be a very long session. So if you could set the clock, that would be great. Thank you. So looking at one of the questions we've got coming in around the leadership buy-in, which is how do you assure that the board is sufficiently informed regarding DR and BC risk management? Joseph, could I turn to you on that?
Sure. As a financial services company, we have to report to the board of directors on at least an annual basis. And of course, we've been doing that for years. The difference is, I think, for the most part, honestly, they weren't that interested in it. When you think years ago, it was, okay, we get it, glad things are going well. And that's for the most part what we were reporting is, we're doing a good job, we're testing, everything looks good. Certainly their interest has peaked, that's nice. And we've got to take advantage of that. And what we're seeing is, even in the annual report, which used to be, again, kind of generic, we're really looking at ways to get in, show some more examples, talk about some incidents that actually occurred in our company, and try to show them tangibly what could happen so that they will increasingly pay attention. And we're finding that to be successful. The other thing is that we're doing more and more simulations with our executives, and not necessarily with the board, but the good news is the board is hearing about those, and they've actually asked us to update them. And so rather than only being the one time a year we were allowed to go and talk to them, we're now being asked to come in and tell more about business continuity, crisis management. So it's presenting opportunities for conversation. And I think that's, in the end, that's what we really need versus sending along more and more reports. Talk to the board, find something that's meaningful for them.
Linda, how about yourself?
I echo all of those comments, and the city of San Francisco also has a hospital, and our new cybersecurity professional that just joined us, CISO, has a very fun story about trying to deal with doctors, right? Doctors know everything. They know about security, they know about everything that can go wrong, they know how to do everything, right? So here's a security professional trying to work with doctors and help them understand risk and appreciate the need for resiliency and continuity of operation. And he was successful by really talking to them about their specific needs, really tailoring it to what would happen if they could not be productive or successful in their care, which would affect their patient. So really drawing that parallel between value, business value, to the event that you might be trying to protect against, really helped him pave the way for doing risk management at a corporate level and really honing in on what needed to be protected. So he was killing two birds with one stone. He was getting buy-in, and he was also coming up with really what those risk factors are that the organization needed to protect against. So that was, I think, a real lesson learned.
Okay, great. It has to be said, I think all of us on the stage can probably think of some incidents that have occurred to our organisations, which does grab the leadership attention. But I've spoken to a number of people who don't have that incident to grab onto and to talk to leadership about. Is there anything else that you think they could talk through? For instance, I've used a lot of case studies internally to try and get across the messaging. If I think to the Horizon scan that's come out recently from the BCI, we've talked a lot about cyber. But that was number 4 in terms of the impacts that those responders had realised this past year. There were some more mundanes at the top, items at the top of that list. So utility supply failure, IT and telephony failure. And the other one there was the severe weather-related incidents. How would you suggest people go away and talk to their leaders to pique their interest and start those conversations if they don't already have the traction there? Frank?
One of the suggestions I would offer is to speak their language. And I don't mean English or French or German. I mean, what are they talking about? And I can tell you at Bank of America, that's very clear from the CEO on down. Everybody at Bank of America is responsible for risk management. It's maybe a small part of your role, maybe all you do. Everybody's responsible. So if you can articulate a risk that can be discussed in the committees at the local level, that becomes an issue that management then says, we've got to watch that, we've got to track that, and we're going to make sure it gets done right. It's going to be mitigated correctly.
Yeah, I'll add that I love the case studies, but I think all too often we make them so generic because we're trying to look at, here's the big what happened, that to an executive or the board members, it kind of doesn't then resonate too well. And so I think if you can actually show, this is what would happen to your business area, or you as the chairman of the board or the CEO, the leader of this business unit, you would have to be speaking to the press. Do you have your talking points ready? What would you personally say? That's a big wake-up call if you realize you've got to be the point person out there, or maybe you're one level removed from that. What are you going to tell your business leader for his or her talking points, and realizing the pressure's been on that person as well.
Great.
And one last thing, I think I had a lesson learned this year and I've been in disaster recovery and response for about 25 years. And I had a lesson learned this year, which was really thinking broadly really about what your risks are. It's easy to get focused on the weather risks and that sort of thing, and cyber. But we had our mayor die. The city of San Francisco's mayor had a heart attack and passed away right before Christmas. And it really was a disaster. The organization had to go through succession planning. We had to understand how roles would change. It was a dramatic change in leadership, all while everyone in the community, not just the organization and the 50 department directors, were in mourning. And I just was really amazed at how that type of emergency, we don't even think about it, but it truly was a crisis, and it required communication. It required a wide range of communication, especially with the community. Our website hits quadrupled in one day with this. I mean, everybody wanted information, and it was just something that I never expected. Of course, we never expect that sort of thing to happen, but just another way to think about preparedness.
Thank you. We've got another question from the audience, which is, what are effective strategies for engaging new executive leadership during times of personnel turnover? Mm-hmm. Do any of you have experience of that?
Well, that was just what we did. Yeah. And I think our new leadership, when they came in, the very first thing in San Francisco when we have new leadership, they visit the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center, and they are given a tour. They're shown what the procedures will be. They're talked to about what their role is. Of course, they're given a binder with all the procedures in it. But more than that, they put names with faces, and here is the phone you'll use, and here's how we'll be contacting you. So it really was the very, very first thing the new leader was exposed to.
Thank you. I think that's a difficult time, because if they're new to the organization, they're learning about the organization, the culture, all of those stakeholders around them as well. Yep. But I certainly found that one-on-one interaction and support from other key stakeholders was essential. So we've talked a little about that the discussion upwards to the board and gaining that buy-in. Anya in the last section was talking about the need from the top and disseminating that down. You're all leaders within your organizations. Could you tell us a little about what you do to set that tone and improve or awareness and the general culture throughout the organization? I know Frank mentioned, for instance, that to an extent everyone is responsible for risk and for identifying and escalating risks that occur. So what do you do to raise awareness and to ensure that there's buy-in for your program throughout the organization as a whole? Linda, could I turn to you on that?
Okay. So we're very, very fortunate that we have a very proactive emergency management department, and they have exercises, different types of exercises and events, and actually a program to engage every single department once a year. I don't know how in the world they do it, but they do it. And so whether it's all levels of the organization, so they start with executive management and work their way down. So they are very responsive. They make it fun. You know, we talked about humor. They make it fun, but it's also helping people understand what the city's practices would be if we were faced with an earthquake or what have you. So I think it's exercises, and I know that sounds like we've all heard that before, but it really is kind of what we need to be aware of. Now, having said that, your exercise needs to include, and is including now, all the different ways communication needs to be handled. So it's not just what are we doing internally to manage the event, but how are we going to communicate on social media platforms? How are we going to engage the community? How are we going to avoid having rumors start on social media? So really being prepared from a communications point of view is also important.
Thank you.
Very true. I agree with the test for sure. You know, it's an old test that I think most all of us do, but the notification once a year, I'm sure at least all of you are doing at least once a year, presents one of the best opportunities. Every single employee in the company is being touched during that, as well as there was weather, I think Linda mentioned earlier. Weather is something we've dealt with for a long time, and I think it becomes very old hat for us, but we need to remember that is something that happens regularly and gives us opportunities to interact with most of the employees throughout the company or the government area. And so can you use each of those and make them a little bit different? So you know, we're testing up using different modalities each time so that it's not the same phone call or same text. In the weather events, it gives us the opportunity to rotate through different leaders, to really push things out to where it's geographically run instead of the corporate level. And so as you're constantly playing with those, you get the attention of people. But frankly, it's hard, obviously. We have very similar to what Frank said, we have the expectation that risk is part of everybody's job. We're fortunate, I would imagine very similarly, that we're seeing that message pushed down. We've seen an increasing number of internal blogs and things. But you know, it's still, when people are pressed to perform what is their core daily job, it's not necessarily in the forefront of their mind to plan for these type of events. So they need reminders.
Thank you. And Linda, we've got a very specific question in around the city of San Francisco and how you engage with your community in terms of resilience, because of course, you have a much broader audience outside of your organization itself. It says, with growing gentrification and social inequalities, how do you include everyone in resilience?
Well, what an excellent question. That is at the heart of San Francisco and our values. We are an inclusive community, and we take that very seriously. But boy, does it present some challenges when you're trying to face a disaster. So not only are you trying to communicate with different languages, different age groups, different income levels. This is probably our biggest challenge, where we have folks that are very tied in and high-tech businesses in our community that we can engage with social media, and we have homeless on the streets. And it is a crisis when it is too hot in San Francisco and people are on the street and don't have water. It is a crisis in San Francisco when we have people that are out in the cold, and we need to make sure they're being sheltered appropriately. So we actually have teams that go out into the community and try to find these people, but it is very, very difficult. And honestly, our emergency management team was brought before the board because they weren't fast enough to do that. So we are really looking for ways to engage that community and make sure that we're doing our best to bring them through any crisis as well as we possibly can.
Obviously, we're not a government organization, but I think if you look inside your companies, you're going to find a lot more of that than you think of as well. Very frequently, when I'm talking to people in our leadership group, they keep in mind, or they think, you know, everyone's got a corporate provided cell phone. So like, well, why didn't they just download that app, or why didn't they respond, et cetera? And you have to remind them, not everyone in the company is in the same type of position. You've got, in our case, thousands of hourly workers. They're not on corporate devices. They're not carrying their laptops home. And so getting people to think about the broad set, fortunately, we don't have to think about the outside weather quite as much as you do, but still, it's getting leaders to remember not everyone has the same type job as they do. And when you're in a corporate campus, sometimes it's really hard to remember. There are people, in our cases, taking phone calls all day long, very, very different types of jobs. And so you do have to plan quite broadly for that as well.
Thank you. We've got another question coming more around those wider communications with the organisation as a whole or broader within the community. And it's asking how we'd manage opt-in, opt-out in terms of emergency communications, what the key considerations are, and what any legal requirements may be associated with that. Frank?
That's a real challenge because from a human resources perspective, we cannot compel people to give us their contact information outside of business hours. So back to Joseph's point about notification testing, emergency notification testing, one of the things that we do is if they don't respond the first time, they get another opportunity. I'll go back to them every week until they give in. And at some point, we'll tell them, we're going to come back to you next week. We're going to come back to you at 7 o'clock on Tuesday night. So so consequences then reinforce the behavior, but the why is an important part too. We need to be able to communicate to you so you don't get in the traffic jam and come to the building that we don't want you to come to today.
Right, exactly right.
It's for your safety. So hopefully the logic trail behind that begins to show people there is a personal interest in providing that information.
Completely agree with framing it up as safety. Specifically to this question on opt-in, opt-out, we opt in all of our employees for the notification tests. However, as Frank said, we cannot force them to provide us their contact points. So everyone's opted in, but if in our human resources database they took their contact points out, we're not going to be able to reach them. With our contractors and third parties, if it is entirely a third-party company, we do not do notifications to them. But if they're contractors for us who work on our campuses, in our facilities, then in real life incidents, we include them in notifications, but we don't include them in the tests. And that's the guidance to this question here with legal requirements. That's what our legal department has advised us. I think requirements is a little bit a strong word in this. I don't think it's super clear, and there is some interpretation that each company does. But to recap that, we opt in everybody and for the test if they're employees. We don't test for our contractors, but in a real life incident we do. And that basically comes down to the duty of care expectation at the end of the day. If you're in our facilities, we feel like in a real life incident, there's more risk if we don't notify them than if we do, and they're perhaps upset that they got a SMS charge.
Thank you. Another question from the audience around business continuity and disaster recovery, and is it explicitly included in the business executive position descriptions? I'd be interested to understand who owns that within your organization and whether it is explicitly stated as their responsibility. Linda.
It is. In San Francisco, every position is required to respond during an emergency. So that was new to me when I recently joined the organization, and I thought it was great. It's in everybody's job description.
I wish that was the answer for us, but it's not. I definitely cannot say it's in all of the executive descriptions. I would say it's in very specific ones where that's a large part of their job, but I'd love to be in a position like Linda's.
I don't think we have the same, I think we have the same as Joseph just mentioned, but I believe we do have the business support managers or the business support executives across the corporation, I believe, do have the business continuity part of their job description. So they're the ones that are escalating that requirement and responsibility across the corporation.
Thank you. Another question here around communications and influence, and I can relate to this one, it has to be said. How do you convince departments that are too busy for business continuity and ITDR that they need to participate?
Well, in San Francisco, I just came from a session, an executive session on DR, and really what it was around was the Napa and Santa Rosa fires. And what was so interesting is they called a meeting, the mayor called a meeting, for all the departments to do the after-action review. So all department directors had to come in and say what was their contribution and how did they contribute to the disaster recovery for our neighbors. And it was amazing, the stories that were told. You know, we had law enforcement professionals working 20 hours a day, directing traffic. They were too tired to drive home, so then the transit organization brought buses in to take them home. And I think it's those stories. It's when you've had to respond, having all the departments there, whether it's the chaplaincy or whoever, talk about what their level of effort was. You start to see everybody realize they can do even more. And I think when you start to see executives lean into DR and really see that they can contribute and they need to contribute even more, and how important it is to our communities, we don't have that question very long.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Joseph.
In a couple of our more recent incidents, we've had the fortune that some of our departments have put together some great videos afterwards. And I think those have been extremely compelling. We've actually had the opportunity to show them in several sessions we do recently. And, you know, if done correctly, they're very dramatic. But you've also, I think the key is we've had people from our company in the video talking about either how they were personally impacted or what they were able to do to help someone else. And I think that's really made a big connection. The other thing I want to say is, so I am doing a session this afternoon on executive engagement, so I won't steal all of my own thunder, but I think sometimes, like in this question, it says, how do we convince people or departments? I think we actually spend a little too much time trying to convince them. If they're really not supportive, I think that you may waste your time there than you could investing in other places that are ready, willing, et cetera. And I think there's ways then that you can highlight the areas that aren't participating. So for example, if an executive's, you know, they don't have time, they don't, okay, we're, you know, certainly try to convince them first, but if they're really not giving in, then, you know, are you willing to document that risk? You know, can we put it in the reports? You know, that can be a choice that you make. But I think when you ask someone to start documenting it, all of a sudden they start thinking a little bit differently. Well, I don't want to tell you I'm willing to do it, but I also don't want to tell someone else that I'm not willing to. Right. And so, you know, giving them essentially that option, then they start to think a little bit differently sometimes.
Thank you. I think that tone from the top links back into this as well, doesn't it? Because you would hope you've got that support from leadership, that they're championing the program, and they should be able to help you gain that engagement as well. But if you don't have that buy-in from the top level, then I'm sure you'd experience a great deal more in terms of challenges with the business.
One of the things that I think is an effective technique as well is to, if they're too busy, we want to tell them, we want to communicate to them as we're approaching them, we're trying to take as much of the administrative burden as we can in our process on our side so that we're really optimizing the things that we need from you. And so we're not asking for more time than we need. So hopefully there is enough buy-in there to keep the door open for a shorter engagement, if you will.
That's a great point, Frank. Probably about 2 years ago, our central crisis management team had a little bit of headbutting with our information security group because it was some question on, you know, if this is a cyber crisis, don't you want to let us, the information security group, run it? And I understand why. You know, they really wanted that as like their time to shine. They had the expertise. What we tried to talk to them is exactly what Frank was saying. Hey, we're not going to be the ones to actually fix the intrusion and hacking, et cetera. Here's what we can do to take some burden off of you. And you know, we're going to take care of coordinating the external messaging, the internal messaging, scheduling the meetings, doing the wrap-up messages, et cetera, so that you can focus on the actual recovery itself. And I think it comes down to some very fundamental misunderstandings sometimes about what does a crisis management team do? And of course, it depends on how you're structured within your company, but often there's the belief that you're going to do it all, which is going to have one of two reactions to people. Either they become so comfortable, inappropriately so, they think, well, they've got it covered, or they're actually on that little bit more offended kind of side of like, well, I think I should be involved there too. So actually clarifying the roles, as simple as it sounds, can be amazingly helpful.
Great, thank you. One final question before we move on to our Leaders of the Future section. And there's a question again from the audience. Do we believe that business continuity should include a degree of preparation for individuals at home? So not just from the work perspective. Linda.
So, of course, I'm going to answer it from a technical perspective. The answer is absolutely yes. Your organization should be preparing to have people either support your organization and systems from home or at least be able to get notifications from home. So challenge your technology staffs to provide remote access in a secure way with multi-factor authentication to your business systems. So whether that's email, whether that's being able to remote log in into even an emergency management system, what we found in the Santa Rosa fires is, quite honestly, our ability to do remote communications is changing the game in emergency response. So in San Francisco, we have a very talented GIS group. And in Santa Rosa, where the fires were, people, that little small community, were very busy taking care of their families. So our GIS team was actually in San Francisco creating evacuation maps and displays and dynamic mapping and sending it remotely to Santa Rosa for their responders. So we know remote access, being able to do work from home, being able to do work from other locations is absolutely essential to response now.
Yeah. And then specifically for the employees to be prepared themselves. I mean, you mentioned taking care of their family. Absolutely everyone's priority should be taking care of their family. And so if they don't have a personal response plan, evacuation plan, the store of food and those kind of things, they're not going to be able to, nor should you ask them to come and take care of the company or the government assets as well. So I think this is, we talked earlier about opting in. This is a tough one because you certainly can't force people to be prepared at home. I think what we do then is a large series of messages at Capital One, at least throughout the year, on what they should be doing. We take advantage principally above the weather seasons. So when it becomes hurricane season, that's a good push for us to send a bunch of messaging around that, and then winter weather as well. What should you be doing at home to prepare? And a large number of employees really appreciate that, honestly.
Great, thank you.
I just think one of the keys is to make sure that people who have relocation kinds of responsibilities have actually bought into that. It wasn't too long ago that we heard about a relocation requirement, and the person said, I'm not leaving my dog or my cat, or whatever. And so establishing clear expectations and getting that buy-in up front is really important. So business continuity recovery is not based on invalid assumptions.
Thank you. Right, we're going to move on to our final topic, which is future leaders now. So I'd like to start by asking you, what skills and knowledge are you looking for when you're identifying future leaders within your own organizations? Linda.
Okay, so of course I need problem solvers. Of course I want technical depth and planners, or what I call preppers. So I found you something online about preppers. I don't know if you know Jeff Foxworthy. He's a comedian and he likes to talk about, if you might be a redneck right? So you might be a prepper. These are the people I'm looking for. You might be a prepper, and the type of person I'm looking for, so one of my interview questions would be, if you open your linen closet and bags of beans fall off the shelf and hit you on the head, you might be a prepper. If you always keep if your home library contains more volumes about survival-related topics than your local public library, you might be a prepper. If you carry more food and medicine in the trunk of your car than most convenience stores even stock, you might be a prepper. If you own enough buckets to form your own neighborhood bucket brigade, you might be a prepper. And if you always have on your person at least 2 ways to make fire, you might be a prepper. Those are the people I'm looking for.
Thank you.
I think we ought to say, just in honor of the venue here, that the skill set that we're looking for leaders tomorrow is to be practically perfect in every way.
There you go, that too.
But on a more tactical level, absolutely agree with those. But I would say tempered initiative. So we don't want people to sit back. Nobody told me to do that. It's not my problem. But we don't want them to be running down every rabbit trail. So we want a discussion with our team members to make sure that they're focused and whatever new issues that they're identifying are prioritized and approved. A continuous learning.
Yeah.
Continuous learning. We need to learn not only about their business continuity profession, but we need to learn about how the business is evolving, about new threats, about new opportunities and technology that's bringing that are transformational and changing our environments.
I agree with both of those points. I think the interesting thing is neither of them, and nor would I, in our first of our lists would be, degrees or practical experience for years and years in business continuity and crisis management. You accumulate that certainly by doing the job, but I want the skill sets that both of them described, the problem solving, the jumping into the situation. It's the right kind of temperament, personality, the learning. I love that point, Frank, the willingness to go out there and do more. We can send them to conferences like this, training and other things to actually get the tactical knowledge that they need. But if you can't communicate, I'll leave that as my last one. It doesn't matter how much knowledge you have. We had a lot of questions obviously come in on executives and board. If you can't communicate to other people and provide a compelling reason why they should be doing these things, it's not going to matter the amount of knowledge they have at the end of the day.
Those, if I could, those are so crucial to have clear, succinct, and focused communication. I'd just like to share an example where I didn't. But I was struggling with this one particular issue, and I was really thinking, I got to push this out. Brute force message. I'm going to get this out. Well, the next day I saw where one of the executives I'd copied had written one of his direct reports. And he said, "What is this? The SAT?" Oh. So I thought, okay, I should have had a quick meeting or something. That wasn't an optimal way to do it, and so we missed those opportunities. And then we established the expectation that I don't want to read stuff from that guy anymore. Got to build that credibility back.
That's a fair point.
So there's lots of certification courses, professional qualifications out there that you can take. But we mentioned there the communications and the soft skills. We mentioned the preppers. What are the soft skills that people should be going out there and looking to evolve? We mentioned networking in the orientation session for first-time attendees yesterday as well. What is it that you're encouraging your own teams to evolve in order to progress within your organizations?
Well, I really echo what has already been said, especially about continuous learning and really about innovation. Because I was talking with Banu, who's here with me from San Francisco, and I said, well, gosh, this is great, all these vendors, all these new technologies. She said it was entirely different a year ago. There were different vendors here. So I think you start to see how fast innovation and new opportunities for us to leverage tool sets is coming our way. So I need people that really look to those as opportunities, are motivated to investigate new things, and really look at how we evolve and how quickly we're evolving, and not to be afraid of that. It's all good.
And I would say, in addition to that, talking to the companies who are typically your competitors, Frank and I are both sitting here from two large financial institutions. I don't think either one of us would consider business continuity, crisis management, resiliency to be like a proprietary thing that, where you want to compete against. Because if he has a major problem, it hurts the whole industry and vice versa. So we find, go out and talk to your peers in other companies within your industry, learn the new tools and techniques that exist out there. And then I think increasingly we're seeing opportunities where companies can partake together on some simulations and actually benefit from the sharing there as well. But really, it's not something that's going to only hurt your company. It really is an industry type thing. So think about it that way.
Thank you. And in terms of keeping tabs on the industry, following innovation, can you give any tips, aside from attending DRJ as we're all doing, and keeping tabs on that today? How can you keep abreast on that? Where do you look? Where do your people go to gain those insights and to keep their finger on the pulse of what's happening in the market?
Some of that's through hiring of new people, honestly. So, we talked about turnover. The question was about turnover really throughout the rest of the company, but turnover in your own teams, I think you need to be very careful about making sure you're bringing in, we talk about diverse talent. In this case, it's diversity of, their background, their experience. Making sure you're getting an equal representation of people coming from outside of your own company, as well as other parts of your company. And even if it's internal to the company, are they coming from different areas? Do they have different backgrounds and experiences? Because the problem is there isn't one way to do any of these, a plan, a test, et cetera. And so you really need that broad thought process.
Thank you. We've got a question in from the audience, which is how do we get more executive level business continuity management roles? And how do we elevate the profession? So BC managers seem to be the ceiling. How do we create C-level positions?
Well, in government, they already are. So that's, it's that important to government. So I guess we're a little bit ahead in that respect. Because we're there to serve the public. So I don't know, gentlemen.
Go ahead.
I'm just going to say, and fortunately for Bank of America, the leadership team has already seen the need to create more. And so when the last reorganization occurred, we went from a global business continuity and recovery single organization to two, where enterprise resiliency and enterprise event response. So they saw the need. Those are different focus, but obviously cousin organizations. So hopefully the executive team in whatever organization you're in gets that value. But that's one.
Do you think
at
it
least
would be
success
born
story
out
we
of risk management? Do you think the
Well,
risk
could be.
managers and
That's
your
where I was
attorneys would start saying, hey, we could use some help?
Yeah, I think some of the problem is we think about it, as long as you leave it as narrow as business continuity. Frank started out with, they've retitled their group as enterprise resiliency. And I was talking about the interrelations with third-party management. I think it's going to be challenging, at least where I come from, for you to see an executive focused on business continuity.
Right.
But see an
That's a very good
executive, multiple executives who focus on risk management, and you take the topics and think about them throughout those roles: information security, physical security, technology resiliency, the third-party aspect. I think that's very, very possible. So years ago, when people would join my team and I would talk about their career pathing, I would hear many of them say, I want to be a business continuity professional. And I would actually discourage them talking about it that way often and try to get them to think about themselves as a risk professional. You may be focused currently on business continuity, but I think if you use that title so much, you're really limiting yourself, and I think then limits the career path as well. And we made the points about talking executives' language. Business continuity and some of those specific terms, that's not necessarily the thing that matters to them. Just talk about it from the risk you're going to see, and that kind of brings you back then also to the way the job description would be written as well. It's all about risk.
Thank you. I'm going to come to each of you in a moment for your closing comments as we're drawing close on time now. At the outset, we also asked you to think through what is the golden nugget that you can all take away as the audience. So I would ask in this final 5 minutes that you also take a moment to reflect on that, whether it's something you can take back to evolve your career, something you could focus on, something you want to go back and talk to leadership about. If there are particular topics that you could take back from these sessions and evolve elements of your program. So Frank, let's start with you. What would your key takeaway for the audience be today?
Just to review back, or to drop back to speak their language, align business continuity initiatives and priorities with the perspective and of the objectives that the leadership is already talking about. It should be fairly straightforward to do that. We're talking about risk management, we're talking about simplifying and improving operational excellence. I mean, so many things align cleanly, and we can show that we listen to what they're saying in the first place. The second thing is introspection. We really need to challenge ourselves as an expense component of the organization to make sure that we're focused on things for value add, not process perpetuation. So we've got to ask ourselves the hard questions so that we make sure we're focused on those things. And then we tell the leadership, this is how we're thinking, this is how we're evolving, and this is how we're aligning with your priorities.
I think I have kind of 2 points as well, but the interconnectedness, I think you heard that as a theme throughout what all three of us were saying, and we didn't plan our remarks in advance, but that you cannot operate in a silo, and you need to make sure your teams are looking across all related disciplines there. And the other is just the irony that today's technology provides. It gives us the ability to strengthen our recovery and resiliency posture. At the same time, it's those things like the cloud and other technology aspects that make it more challenging for us to protect as well. And so, you really need a deep knowledge. It doesn't have to be every person on your team have that technology depth, but you've got to have resources that do have it and know where those resources are, because they're increasingly invaluable to you.
Mm-hmm. So the problem with going last is they take all your topics. But I think I'd start off with eyes wide open on what your vision of what a disaster looks like. And I've dealt with, just in the last year, workplace violence and our mayor's secession planning. So those weren't disasters I was expecting. So eyes wide open for all of us on what our definition of disaster and what our need for preparedness is. And then I think what comes to mind for me is mutual aid. I mean, that's a very big topic in government. We work closely with cities, counties, the state, and federal agencies to try to restore service and try to respond effectively to an emergency. So mutual aid usually requires memorandums of understanding. It requires cross-training. How many of us have different notification systems? That's what hit California so hard, is each city and county had a different mass notification system, and they were all called something different. So nobody knew what reverse 911 was. Nobody knew how to talk to each other in the same language. So I think we need to have these conversations across our industry and our communities if we're going to be able to support each other, and that's where our strength and resiliency will come from.
Thank you. I'd like to say thank you very much to all of the audience members who submitted questions. There were a few there that we didn't get through, so we will make sure that they're consolidated and shared on the website with some responses. Thank you very much as well to our panelists, to Frank, to Joseph, and Linda. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.